The Last Command, Chapter 1. Gliding through the blackness of deep space, the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera pointed its mighty arrowhead shape toward the dim star of its target system, 3,000ths of a light year away, and prepared itself for war. All systems show battle ready, Admiral, the comm officer reported from the crew side pit. The task force is beginning to check in. Very good, Lieutenant, Grand Admiral Thrawn nodded. Inform me when all have done so. Captain Pelion? Sir, Pelion said, searching his superior's face for the stress the Grand Admiral must be feeling. The stress he himself was certainly feeling. This was not just another tactical strike against the rebellion, after all. Not a minor shipping raid, or even a complex but straightforward hit and fade against some insignificant planetary base. After nearly a month of frenzied preparations, Thrawn's master campaign for the Empire's final victory was about to be launched. But if the Grand Admiral was feeling any tension, he was keeping it to himself. Begin the countdown, he told Pelion, his voice as calm as if he were ordering dinner. Yes, sir, Pelion said, turning back to the group of one-quarter size holographic figures standing before him in the Chimera's aft bridge hologram pod. Gentlemen, launch marks. Bellicose, 3 minutes. Acknowledged, Chimera, Captain Aben said, his proper military demeanor not quite masking his eagerness to take this war back to the rebellion. Good hunting. The hollow image sputtered and vanished as the bellicose raised its deflector shields, cutting off long-range communications. Pelion shifted his attention to the next image in line. Relentless, 4.5 minutes. Acknowledged, Captain Dorja said, cupping his right fist in his left in an ancient Mershef gesture of victory as he too vanished from the hologram pod. Pelion glanced at his datapad. Judicator, 6 minutes. We're ready, Chimera, Captain Brandy said, his voice soft. Soft, and just a little bit wrong. Pelion frowned at him. Quarter-sized hollows didn't show a lot of detail, but even so, the expression on Brandy's face was easy to read. It was the expression of a man out for blood. This is war, Captain Brandy, Thrawn said, coming up silently to Pelion's side. Not an opportunity for personal revenge. I understand my duty, Admiral, Brandy said stiffly. Thrawn's blue-black eyebrows lifted slightly. Do you, Captain? Do you indeed? Slowly, reluctantly, some of the fire faded from Brandy's face. Yes, sir, he muttered. My duty is to the Empire, and to you, and to the ships and crews under my command. Very good, Thrawn said. To the living, in other words, not to the dead. Brandy was still glowering, but he gave a dutiful nod. Yes, sir. Never forget that, Captain, Thrawn warned him. The fortunes of war rise and fall, and you may be assured that the rebellion will be repaid in full for the destruction of the Peremptory at the Katana Fleet skirmish. But that repayment will occur in the context of our overall strategy, not as an act of private vengeance. His glowing red eyes narrowed slightly. Certainly not by any fleet captain under my command. I trust I make myself clear. Brandy's cheek twitched. Pelion had never thought of the man as brilliant, but he was smart enough to recognize a threat when he heard one. Very clear, Admiral. Good. Thrawn eyed him a moment longer, then nodded. I believe you've been given your launch mark. Yes, sir. Judicator out. Thrawn looked at Pelion. Continue, Captain, he said, and turned away. Yes, sir. Pelion looked at his datapad. Nemesis? He finished the list without further incident. By the time the last hollow image disappeared, the final check-in from their own task force was complete. The timetable appears to be running smoothly, Thrawn said, as Pelion returned to his command station. The Stormhawk reports that the guide freighters launched on time with tow cables functioning properly, and we've just intercepted a general emergency call from the Ando system. The Bellicose and its task force, right on schedule. Any response, sir? Pelion asked. The rebel base at Ord Padrone acknowledged, Thrawn said. It should be interesting to see how much help they send. Pelion nodded. The rebels had seen enough of Thrawn's tactics by now to expect Ando to be a feint, and to respond accordingly. But on the other hand, an attack force consisting of an Imperial Star Destroyer and 8 Katana Fleet dreadnoughts was hardly something they could afford to dismiss out of hand either. Not that it really mattered. They would send a few ships to Ando to fight the Bellicose, and a few more to Filv to fight the Judicator, and a few more to Crondre to fight the Nemesis, and so on and so on. By the time the Death's Head hit the base itself, Ord Padrone would be down to a skeleton defense and screaming itself for all the reinforcements the rebellion could scramble. And that was where those reinforcements would go, leaving the Empire's true target ripe for the picking. Pelion looked out the forward viewport at the star of the Yukio system dead ahead, his throat tightening as he contemplated again the enormous conceit of this whole plan. With planetary shields able to hold off all but the most massive turbolaser and proton torpedo bombardment, conventional wisdom held that the only way to subdue a modern world was to put a fast moving ground force down at the edges and send them overland to destroy the shield generators. Between the fire laid down by the ground force and the subsequent orbital assault, the target world was always badly damaged by the time it was finally taken. The alternative, landing hundreds of thousands of troops in a major ground campaign that could stretch into months or years, was no better. To capture a planet relatively undamaged, but with shield generators still intact, was considered an impossibility. That bit of military wisdom would fall today, along with Yukio itself. Intercepted distress signal from Filv, Admiral, the comm officer reported. Ord Padrone again responding. Good. Thrawn consulted his chrono. 7 minutes, I think, and we'll be able to move. His lips compressed, just noticeably. I suppose we'd better confirm that our exalted Jedi Master is ready to do his part. Pelion hid a grimace. Yorus Sabaoth, insane clone of the long-dead Jedi Master Yorus Sabaoth, who a month ago had proclaimed himself the true heir to the Empire. He didn't like talking to the man any more than Thrawn did, but he might as well volunteer. If he didn't, it would simply become an order. I'll go, sir, he said, standing up. Thank you, Captain, Thrawn said, as if Pelion would have had a choice. He felt the mental summons the moment he stepped beyond the force protection of the Salamiri scattered about the bridge on their nutrient frames. Master Sabaoth, clearly, was impatient for the operation to begin. Preparing himself as best he could, fighting against Sabaoth's casual mental pressure to hurry, Pelion made his way down to Thrawn's command room. The chamber was brightly lit, in marked contrast to the subdued lighting the Grand Admiral usually preferred. Captain Pelion, Sabaoth called, beckoning to him from the double display ring in the center of the room. Come in. I've been waiting for you. The rest of the operation has taken my full attention, Pelion told him stiffly, trying to hide his distaste for the man, knowing full well how futile such attempts were. Of course, Sabaoth smiled, a smile that showed more effectively than any words his amusement with Pelion's discomfort. No matter. I take it Grand Admiral Thrawn is finally ready. Almost, Pelion said. We want to clear out Ord Padrone as much as possible before we move. Sabaoth snorted. You continue to assume the New Republic will dance to the Grand Admiral's tune. They will, Pelion said. The Grand Admiral has studied the enemy thoroughly. He studied their artwork, Sabaoth countered, with another snort. That will be useful if the time ever comes when the New Republic has nothing but artists left to throw against us. A signal from the display ring saved Pelion from the need to reply. We're moving, he told Sabaoth, starting a mental countdown of the 76 seconds it would take to reach the Yukio system from their position, and trying not to let Sabaoth's words get under his skin. He didn't understand himself how Thrawn could so accurately learn the innermost secrets of a species from its artwork, but he'd seen that knowledge proved often enough to trust the Grand Admiral's instincts on such things. Sabaoth hadn't. But then, Sabaoth wasn't really interested in an honest debate on the subject. For the past month, ever since declaring himself to be the true heir to the Emperor, Sabaoth had been pressing this quiet war against Thrawn's credibility, implying that true insight came only through the Force, and therefore only through him. Pelion himself didn't buy that argument. The Emperor had been deep into this Force thing too, and he hadn't even been able to predict his own death at Endor. But the seeds of uncertainty Sabaoth was trying to sow were nevertheless starting to take hold, particularly among the less experienced of Thrawn's officers, which was, for Pelion, just one more reason why this attack had to succeed. The outcome hinged as much on Thrawn's reading of the Yukian cultural ethos as it did on straight military tactics. On Thrawn's conviction that, at a basic psychological level, the Yukians were terrified of the impossible. "He will not always be right," Sabaoth said into Pelion's musings. Pelion bit down hard on the inside of his cheek, the skin of his back crawling at having had his thoughts so casually invaded. "You don't have any concept of privacy, do you?" he growled. "I am the Empire, Captain Pelion," Sabaoth said, his eyes glowing with a dark, fanatical fire. "Your thoughts are a part of your service to me." "My service is to Grand Admiral Thrawn," Pelion said stiffly. Sabaoth smiled. "You may believe that if you wish, but to business. True Imperial business. When the battle here is over, Captain Pelion, I want a message sent to Wayland." "Announcing your imminent return, no doubt," Pelion said sourly. Sabaoth had been insisting for nearly a month now that he would soon be going back to his former home on Wayland, where he would take command of the cloning facility in the Emperor's old storehouse inside Mount Tantus. So far, he'd been too busy trying to subvert Thrawn's position to do anything more than talk about it. "Do not worry, Captain Pelion," Sabaoth said, all amused again. "When the time is right, I will indeed return to Wayland, which is why you will contact Wayland after this battle is over and order them to create a clone for me. A very special clone." "Grand Admiral Thrawn will have to authorize that," were the words that came to mind. "What kind do you want?" were the ones that inexplicably came out. Pelion blinked, running the memory over in his mind again. Yes, that was what he'd said, all right. Sabaoth smiled again at his silent confusion. "I merely wish a servant," he said. "Someone who will be waiting there for me when I return. Formed from one of the Emperor's prize souvenirs. Sample B233254, I believe it was. You will, of course, impress upon the garrison commander that this must be done in total secrecy." "I will do nothing of the sort." "Yes," Pelion heard himself say instead. The sound of the word shocked him, but certainly he didn't mean it. On the contrary, as soon as this battle was over, he'd be reporting this little incident directly to Thrawn. "You will also keep this conversation a private matter between ourselves," Sabaoth said lazily. "Once you have obeyed, you will forget it ever happened." Of course, Pelion nodded, just to shut him up. Yes, he'd report this to Thrawn, all right. The Grand Admiral would know what to do. The countdown reached 0, and on the main wall display, the planet Yukio appeared. "We should put up a tactical display, Master Sabaoth," he said. Sabaoth waved a hand. "As you wish." Pelion reached over the double display ring and touched the proper key, and in the center of the room, the holographic tactical display appeared. The Chimera was driving towards high orbit above the sunside equator. The 10 Katana Fleet dreadnoughts of its task force were splitting up into outer and inner defense positions, and the Stormhawk was coming in as backstop from the night side. Other ships, mostly freighters and other commercial types, could be seen dropping through the brief gaps command control was opening for them in Yukio's energy shield, a hazy blue shell surrounding the planet about 50 kilometers above the surface. Two of the blips flashed red, the guide freighters for the Stormhawk, looking as innocent as all the rest of the ships scurrying madly for cover. The freighters, and the four invisible companions they towed. "Invisible only to those without eyes to see them," Sabaoth murmured. So now you can see the ships themselves, can you? Pelion growled. How Jedi skills grow. He'd been hoping to irritate Sabaoth a little. Not much, just a little, but it was a futile effort. I can see the men inside your precious cloaking shields, the Jedi Master said placidly. I can see their thoughts and guide their wills. What does the metal itself matter? Pelion felt his lip twist. I suppose there's a lot that doesn't matter to you, he said. From the corner of his eye, he saw Sabaoth smile. What doesn't matter to a Jedi Master does not matter to the universe. The freighters and cloaked cruisers were nearly to the shield now. They'll be dropping the tow cables as soon as they're inside the shield, Pelion reminded Sabaoth. Are you ready? The Jedi Master straightened up in his seat and closed his eyes to slits. I await the Grand Admiral's command, he said sardonically. For another second, Pelion looked at the other's composed expression, a shiver running up through him. He could remember vividly the first time Sabaoth had tried this kind of direct long-distance control. Could remember the pain that had been on Sabaoth's face, the pinched look of concentration and agony as he struggled to hold the mental contacts. Barely 2 months ago, Thrawn had confidently said that Sabaoth would never be a threat to the Empire because he lacked the ability to focus and concentrate his Jedi powers on a long-term basis. Somehow, between that time and now, Sabaoth had obviously succeeded in learning the necessary control, which left Sabaoth as a threat to the Empire. A very dangerous threat indeed. The intercom beeped. Captain Pelion. Pelion reached over to the display ring and touched the key, pushing away his fears about Sabaoth as best he could. For the moment, at least, the fleet needed Sabaoth. Fortunately, perhaps, Sabaoth also needed the fleet. We're ready, Admiral, he said. Stand by, Thrawn said. Tow cables detaching now. They are free, Sabaoth said. They are under power, moving now to their appointed positions. Confirm that they're beneath the planetary shield, Thrawn ordered. For the first time, a hint of the old strain crossed Sabaoth's face. Hardly surprising. With the cloaking shield preventing the Chimera from seeing the cruisers and at the same time blinding the cruiser's own sensors, the only way to know exactly where they were was for Sabaoth to do a precise location check on the mines he was touching. All 4 ships are beneath the shield, he said. Be absolutely certain, Jedi Master. If you're wrong, I am not wrong, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth cut him off harshly. I will do my part in this battle. Concern yourself with yours. For a moment the intercom was silent. Pelion winced, visualizing the Grand Admiral's expression. Very well, Jedi Master, Thrawn said calmly. Prepare to do your part. There was the double click of an opening comm channel. This is the Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, calling the Overliege of Yukio, Thrawn said. In the name of the Empire, I declare the Yukian system to be once again under the mandate of Imperial law and the protection of Imperial forces. You will lower your shields, recall all military units to their bases, and prepare for an orderly transfer of command. There was no response. I know you're receiving this message, Thrawn continued. If you fail to respond, I will have to assume that you mean to resist the Empire's offer. In that event, I would have no choice but to open hostilities. Again, silence. They're sending another transmission, Pelion heard the comm officer say. Sounds a little more panicked than the first one was. I'm certain their third will be even more so, Thrawn told him. Prepare for firing sequence 1. Master Sabaoth? The cruisers are ready, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth said. As am I. Be sure that you are, Thrawn said, quietly threatening. Unless the timing is absolutely perfect, this entire show will be worse than useless. Turbolaser Battery 3. Stand by firing sequence 1 on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Fire. On the tactical hologram, a double lance of green fire angled out from the Chimera's turbolaser batteries towards the planet below. The blast struck the hazy blue of the planetary shield, splashed slightly as their energy was defocused and reflected back into space. And with the desired perfect timing, the two cloaked cruisers hovering on repulsor lifts beneath the shield at those 2 points fired in turn, their turbolaser blasts sizzling through the atmosphere into two of Yukio's major air defense bases. That was what Pelion saw. The Yukians, with no way of knowing about the cloaked cruisers, would have seen the Chimera fire two devastating shots cleanly through an impenetrable planetary shield. Third transmission cut off right in the middle, sir, the comm officer reported with a touch of dark humor. I think we surprised them. Let's convince them it wasn't a fluke, Thrawn said. Prepare firing sequence 2. Master Sabaoth? The cruisers are ready. Turbolaser battery 2. Standby firing sequence 2 on my mark. 3, 2, 1. Fire! Again the green fire lanced out, and again, with perfect timing, the cloaked cruisers created their illusion. Well done, Thrawn said. Master Sabaoth, move the cruisers into position for sequences 3 and 4. As you command, Grand Admiral Thrawn. Unconsciously, Pelion braced himself. Sequence 4 had two of the Yukian's 30 overlapping shield generators as its targets. Launching such an attack would mean that Thrawn had given up on his stated goal of taking Yukio with its planetary defenses intact. Imperial Star Destroyer Chimera, this is Tol Dosla of the Yukian Overliege, a slightly quavering voice came from the intercom speaker. We would ask you to cease your bombardment of Yukio while we discuss terms for surrender. My terms are quite simple, Thrawn said. You will begin by lowering your planetary shield and allowing my forces to land. They will be given control of the shield generators themselves and of all ground-to-space weaponry. All fighting vehicles larger than command speeders will be moved to designated military bases and turned over to Imperial control. Though you will, of course, be ultimately answerable to the Empire, your political and social systems will remain under your control, provided your people behave themselves, of course. And once these changes have been implemented, then you will be part of the Empire, with all the rights and duties that implies. There will be no war-level tax levies? Dosla asked suspiciously. No forced conscription of our young people? Pelion could imagine Thrawn's grim smile. No, the Empire would never need to bother with forced conscription again. Not with the Emperor's collection of Spartan cloning cylinders in their hands. No to your second question. A qualified no to your first, Thrawn told the Yukian. As you are obviously aware, most Imperial worlds are currently under war status taxation levels. However, there are exceptions, and it is likely that your share of the war effort will come directly from your extensive food production and processing facilities. There was a long pause from the other end. Dosla was no fool, Pelion realized. The Yukian knew full well what Thrawn had in mind for his world. First, it would be direct Imperial control of the ground and space defenses, then direct control of the food distribution system, the processing facilities, and the vast farming and livestock grazing regions themselves. And in a very short time, the entire planet would have become nothing more than a supply depot for the Imperial war machine. But the alternative was for him to stand silently by and watch as his world was utterly and impossibly demolished before his eyes. And he knew that too. We will lower the planetary shields, Chimera, as a gesture of good faith, Dosla said at last, his tone defiant, but with a hint of defeat to it. But before the generators and ground and space weaponry can be turned over to Imperial forces, we shall require certain guarantees regarding the safety of the Yukian people and our land. Certainly, Thrawn said, without any trace of the gloating that most Imperial commanders would have indulged in at this point. A small act of courtesy that Pelion knew was as precisely calculated as the rest of the attack had been. Permitting the Yukian leaders to surrender with their dignity intact would slow down the inevitable resistance to Imperial rule until it was too late. A representative will be on his way shortly to discuss the particulars with your government, Thrawn continued. Meanwhile, I presume you have no objection to our forces taking up preliminary defense positions? A sigh, more felt than really heard. We have no objections, Chimera, Dosla said reluctantly. We are lowering the shield now. On the tactical display, the blue haze surrounding the planet faded away. Master Sabaoth, have the cruisers move to polar positions, Thrawn ordered. We don't want any of the dropships blundering into them. General Cavell, you may begin transporting your forces to the surface. Standard defensive positions around all targets. Acknowledged, Admiral, Cavell's voice said, a little too dryly, and Pelion felt a tight smile twitch at his lip. It had only been 2 weeks since the top fleet and army commanders had been let in on the secret of the Mount Tantus cloning project, and Cavell was one of those who still hadn't adjusted completely to the idea. Though the fact that 3 of the companies he was about to lead down to the surface were composed entirely of clones might have had something to do with his skepticism. On the tactical hologram, the first waves of dropships and TIE fighter escorts had exited the Chimera and Stormhawk, fanning out towards their assigned targets. Clones and dropships about to carry out Imperial orders, as the clone crews and the cloaked cruisers had already done so well. Pelion frowned, an odd and uncomfortable thought suddenly striking him. Had Sabaoth been able to guide the cruisers so well because each of their 1,000-man crews were composed of variants on just 20 or so different minds? Or, even more disturbing, could part of the Jedi Master's split-second control have been due to the fact that Sabaoth was himself a clone? And either way, did that mean that the Mount Tantus project was playing directly into Sabaoth's hands in his bid for power? Perhaps. One more question he would have to bring to Thrawn's attention. Pelion looked down at Sabaoth, belatedly remembering that in the Jedi Master's presence such thoughts were not his private property. But Sabaoth wasn't looking at him, knowingly or otherwise. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, the skin of his face taut. A faint smile just beginning to crease his lips. Master Sabaoth? There, Sabaoth whispered, his voice deep and husky. There, he repeated, louder this time. Pelion frowned back at the tactical hologram. Who's where? He asked. They're at Filth, Sabaoth said. Abruptly, he looked up at Pelion, his eyes bright and insane. My Jedi are at Filth. Master Sabaoth, confirm that the cruisers have moved to polar positions, Thrawn's voice came sharply. Then report on the feint battles. My Jedi are at Filth, Sabaoth cut him off. What do I care about your battles? Sabaoth. With a wave of his hand, Sabaoth shut off the intercom. Now, Leia Organa Solo, he murmured softly, you are mine. The Millennium Falcon twisted hard to starboard as a TIE fighter shot past overhead, lasers blazing away madly as it tried unsuccessfully to track the freighter's maneuver. Clenching her teeth firmly against the movement, Leia Organa Solo watched as one of the escort X-Wings blew the Imperial starfighter into a cloud of flaming dust. The sky spun around the Falcon's canopy as the ship rolled back towards its original heading. Look out! 3PO wailed from the seat behind Leia as another TIE fighter roared in towards them from the side. The warning was unnecessary. With deceptive ungainliness, the Falcon was already corkscrewing back the other direction to bring its ventral quad laser battery to bear. Faintly audible even through the cockpit door, Leia heard the sound of a Wookiee battle roar, and the TIE fighter went the way of its late partner. Good shot, Chewie, Han Solo called into the intercom as he got the Falcon leveled again. Wedge? Still with you, Falcon, Wedge Antilles' voice came back promptly. We're clear for now, but there's another wave of TIE fighters on the way. Yeah. Han glanced at Leia. It's your call, sweetheart. You still want to try and reach ground? 3PO gave a little electronic gasp. Surely, Captain Solo, you aren't suggesting... Put a choke valve on it, Goldenrod, Han cut him off. Leia? Leia looked out the cockpit canopy at the Imperial Star Destroyer and 8 dreadnoughts arrayed against the beleaguered planet ahead, clustering around it like Minox around an unshielded power generator. It was to have been her last diplomatic mission before settling in to await the birth of her twins, A quick trip to a calm and nervous Filvian government and demonstrate the New Republic's determination to protect the systems in their sector. Some demonstration. There's no way we could make it through all of that, she told Han reluctantly. Even if we could, I doubt the Filvians would risk opening up the shield to let us in. We'd better make a run for it. Sounds good to me, Han grunted. Wedge, we're pulling out. Stay with us. Copy, Falcon, Wedge said. You'll have to give us a few minutes to calculate the jump back. Don't bother, Han said, swiveling around in his seat to key into the nav computer. We'll feed you the numbers from here. Copy. Rogue Squadron, screen formation. I'm starting to get tired of this, Han told Leia, swiveling back to face front. I thought you said your Nagri pals were going to leave you alone. This has nothing to do with the Nagri, Leia shook her head, an odd half-felt tension stretching at her forehead. Was it her imagination, or were the Imperial ships surrounding Filv starting to break formation? This is Grand Admiral Thrawn playing with his new Dark Force dreadnoughts. Yeah, Han agreed quietly, and Leia winced at the momentary flash of bitterness in his sense. Despite everyone's best efforts to persuade him otherwise, Han still considered it his own personal fault that Thrawn had gotten to the derelict Katana Fleet ships, the so-called Dark Force, ahead of the New Republic. I wouldn't have thought he could get them reconditioned that fast, Han added as he twisted the Falcon's nose away from Filv and back towards deep space. Leia swallowed. The strange tension was still there, like a distant malevolent processing against the edges of her mind. Maybe he has enough Sparty cylinders to clone some engineers and techs as well as soldiers. That's sure a fun thought, Han said, and through her tension, Leia could sense his sudden change in mood as he tapped the comm switch. Wedge, take a look back at Filv and tell me if I'm seeing things. Over the comm, Leia could hear Wedge's thoughtful intake of air. You mean like the whole Imperial force breaking off their attack and coming after us? Yeah, that. Looks real enough to me, Wedge said. Could be a good time to get out of here. Yeah, Han said slowly. Maybe. Leia frowned at her husband. There'd been something in his voice. Han? The Filvians would have called for help before they put up that shield, right? Han asked her, forehead furrowed with thought. Right, Leia agreed cautiously. And the nearest New Republic base is Ord Padrone, right? Right. Okay, Rogue Squadron. We're changing course to starboard. Stay with me. He keyed his board, and the Falcon started the sharp curve to the right. Watch it, Falcon. This is taking us back towards that TIE fighter group, Wedge warned. We're not going that far, Han assured him. Here's our vector. He straightened out the ship onto their new course heading and threw a look at the rear display. Good. They're still chasing us. Behind him, the nav computer beeped its notification that the jump coordinates were ready. Wedge, we've got your coordinates, Leia said, reaching for the data transmission key. Hold it, Falcon, Wedge cut her off. We've got company to starboard. Leia looked that direction, her throat tightening as she saw what Wedge meant. The approaching TIE fighters were coming up fast, and already were close enough to eavesdrop on any transmission the Falcon tried to make to its escort. Sending Wedge the jump coordinates now would be an open invitation for the Imperials to have a reception committee waiting at the other end. Perhaps I can be of assistance, Your Highness, 3PO offered brightly. As you know, I am fluent in over 6 million forms of communication. I could transmit the coordinates to Commander Antilles in Bordist or Valkyrie trade language, for example. And then you'd send him the translation? Han put in dryly. Of course, the droid broke off. Oh dear, he said, sounding embarrassed. Yeah, well, don't worry about it, Han said. Wedge, you were at Zyquid 2 years ago, weren't you? Yes. Ah, a Kraken twist? Right. On two. 1, 2. Outside the canopy, Leia caught a glimpse of the X-Wing swinging into a complicated new escort formation around the Falcon. What is this bias? She asked. Our way out, Han told her, checking the rear display again. Pull the coordinates, add a 2 to the second number of each one, and then send the whole package to the X-Wings. I see. Leia nodded her understanding as she got to work. Altering the second digit wouldn't change the appearance of their exit vector enough for the Imperials to catch on to the trick, but it would be more than enough to put in the chase force a couple of light years off target. Clever. And that little flight maneuver they did just now was just window dressing? Right. Makes anyone watching think that's all there is to it. A little something Pash Kraken came up with at that fiasco of Queen. Han glanced at the rear display again. I think we got enough lead to outrun them, he said. Let's try. We're not jumping to light speed? Leia frowned, an old and rather painful memory floating up from the back of her mind. That mad scramble away from Hoth when Darth Vader's whole fleet breathing down their necks in a hyperdrive that turned out to be broken. Han threw her a sideways look. Don't worry, sweetheart. The hyperdrive's working fine today. Let's hope so, Leia murmured. See, as long as they're chasing us, they can't bother Phil, Han went on. And the farther we draw them away, the longer the backup force will have to get here from Ord Padron. The brilliant green flash of a near miss cut off Leia's intended response. I think we've given them all the time we can, she told Han. Within her, she could sense the turmoil coming from her unborn twins. Can we please get out of here? A second bolt spattered off the Falcon's upper deflector shield. Yeah, I think you're right, Han agreed. Wedge, you ready to leave this party? Whenever you are, Falcon, Wedge said. Go ahead. We'll follow when you're clear. Right. Reaching over, Han gripped the hyperdrive levers and pulled them gently back. Through the cockpit canopy, the stars stretched themselves into star lines, and they were safe. Leia took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Within her, she could still sense the twins' anxiety, and for a moment she turned her mind to the job of calming them down. It was a strange sensation, she'd often thought, touching minds that dealt in emotion and pure sensation instead of pictures and words. So different from the minds of Han and Luke and her other friends. So different, too, from the distant mind that had been orchestrating that Imperial attack force. Behind her, the door slid open and Chewbacca came into the cockpit. Good shooting, Chewie, Han told the Wookiee as he heaved his massive bulk into the portside passenger seat beside 3PO. You have any more trouble with the horizontal control arm? Chewbacca rumbled a negative. His dark eyes studying Leia's face, he growled her a question. I'm all right, Leia assured him, blinking back sudden and inexplicable tears. Really? She looked at Han to find him frowning at her too. You weren't worried, were you? He asked. It was just an Imperial task force. Nothing to get excited about. She shook her head. It wasn't that, Han. There was something else back there. A kind of... She shook her head again. I don't know. Perhaps it was similar to your indisposition at Endor, 3PO offered helpfully. You remember, when you collapsed while Chewbacca and I were repairing the... Chewbacca rumbled a warning, and the droid abruptly shut up. But far too late. No. Let him talk, Han said, his sense going all protectively suspicious as he looked at Leia. What indisposition was this? There wasn't anything to it, Han, Leia assured him, reaching over to take his hand. On our first orbit around Endor, we passed through the spot where the Death Star blew up. For a few seconds, I could feel something like the Emperor's presence around me. That's all. Oh, that's all, Han said sarcastically, throwing a brief glare back at Chewbacca. A dead Emperor tries to make a grab for you, and you don't think that's worth mentioning? Now you're being silly, Leia chided. There was nothing to worry about. It was over quickly, and there weren't any after effects. Really. Anyway, what I felt back at Filv was completely different. Glad to hear it, Han said, not yet ready to let it go. Did you have any of the med people check you over or anything after you got back? Well, there really wasn't any time before. Fine. You do it as soon as we're back. Leia nodded with a quiet sigh. She knew that tone, and it wasn't something she could wholeheartedly argue against anyway. All right, if I can find time. You'll make time, Han countered, or I'll have Luke lock you in the med center when he gets back. I mean it, sweetheart. Leia squeezed his hand, feeling a similar squeeze on her heart as she did so. Luke, off alone in Imperial territory. but he was all right. He had to be. All right, she told Han. I'll get checked out. I promise. Good, he said, his eyes searching her face. So what was it you felt back at Filv? I don't know. She hesitated. Maybe it was the same thing Luke felt on the Katana. You know, when the Imperials put that landing party of clones aboard. Yeah, Han agreed doubtfully. Maybe. Those dreadnoughts were awfully far away. There were probably a lot more clones, though, too. Yeah, maybe, Han said again. Well, I suppose Chewie and me had better get to work on that ion flux stabilizer before it quits on us completely. Can you handle things up here okay, sweetheart? I'm fine, Leia assured him, just as glad to be leaving this line of conversation. You two go ahead. Because the other possibility was one that she'd just as soon not think about right now. The Emperor, as it had long been rumored, had had the ability to use the Force to exercise direct control over his military forces. If the Jedi Master Luke had confronted on Yomark had that same ability. Reaching down, she caressed her belly and focused on the pair of tiny minds within her. No, it was indeed not something she wanted to think about. I presume, Thrawn said in that deadly calm voice of his, that you have some sort of explanation. Slowly, deliberately, Sabaoth lifted his head from the command room's double display circle to look at the Grand Admiral. At the Grand Admiral, and with undisguised contempt, at the Ysalamir on its nutrient frame slung across Thrawn's shoulders. Do you likewise have an explanation, Grand Admiral Thrawn? He demanded. You broke off the diversionary attack on Filv, Thrawn said, ignoring Sabaoth's question. You then proceeded to send the entire task force on a dead-end chase. And you, Grand Admiral Thrawn, have failed to bring my Jedi to me, Sabaoth countered. His voice, Pelion noticed uneasily, was slowly rising in both pitch and volume. You, your tame Nogri, your entire empire, all of you have failed. Thrawn's glowing red eyes narrowed. Indeed. And was it also our failure that you were unable to hold on to Luke Skywalker after we delivered him to you on Yomark? You did not deliver him to me, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Sabaoth insisted. I summoned him there through the Force. It was Imperial intelligence who planted the rumor that Yoris Sabaoth had returned and been seen on Yomark, Thrawn cut him off coldly. It was Imperial transport who brought you there, Imperial supply who arranged and provisioned that house for you, and Imperial engineering who built the camouflaged island landing site for your use. The Empire did its part to get Skywalker into your hands. It was you who failed to keep him there. No, Sabaoth snapped. Skywalker left Yomark because Mara Jade escaped from you and twisted his mind against me. And she will pay for that. You hear me? She shall pay! For a long moment, Thrawn was silent. You threw the entire Filv task force against the Millennium Falcon, he said at last, his voice under control again. Did you succeed in capturing Leia Organa Solo? No, Sabaoth growled, but not because she didn't want to come to me. She does, just as Skywalker does. Thrawn threw a glance at Pelion. She wants to come to you, he asked. Sabaoth smiled. Very much, he said, his voice unexpectedly losing all its anger, becoming almost dreamy. She wants me to teach her children, he continued, his eyes drifting around the command room, to instruct them in the ways of the Jedi, to create them in my own image, because I am the Master, the only one there is. He looked back at Thrawn. You must bring her to me, Grand Admiral Thrawn, he said, his manner somewhere halfway between solemn and pleading. We must free her from her entrapment among those who fear her powers. They'll destroy her if we don't. Of course we must, Thrawn said soothingly. But you must leave that task to me. All I need is a little more time. Sabaoth frowned with thought, his hand slipping up beneath his beard to finger the medallion hanging on its neck chain, and Pelion felt a shiver run up his back. No matter how many times he saw it happen, He would never get used to these sudden dips into the slippery twilight of clone madness. It had, he knew, been a universal problem with the early cloning experiments, a permanent mental and emotional instability, inversely scaled to the length of the duplicate's growth cycle. Few of the scientific papers on the subject had survived the Clone Wars era, but Pelion had come across one that had suggested that no clone grown to maturity in less than a year would be stable enough to survive outside of a totally controlled environment. Given the destruction they'd unleashed on the galaxy, Pelion had always assumed that the clone masters had eventually found at least a partial solution to the problem. Whether they had recognized the underlying cause of the madness was another question entirely. It could very well be that Thrawn was the first to truly understand it. "Very well, Grand Admiral Thrawn," Sabaoth said abruptly. "You may have one final chance, but I warn you, it will be your last. After that, I will take the matter into my own hands." Beneath the bushy eyebrows, his eyes flashed. "And I warn you further. If you cannot accomplish even so small a task, perhaps I will deem you unworthy to lead the military forces of my empire." Thrawn's eyes glittered, but he merely inclined his head slightly. "I accept your challenge, Master Sabaoth." "Good." Deliberately, Sabaoth resettled himself into his seat and closed his eyes. "You may leave me now, Grand Admiral Thrawn. I wish to meditate and to plan for the future of my Jedi." For a moment, Thrawn stood silently, his glowing red eyes gazing unblinkingly at Sabaoth. Then he shifted his gaze to Pelion. "You'll accompany me to the bridge, Captain," he said. "I want you to oversee the defense arrangements for the Yukio system." "Yes, sir," Pelion said, glad of any excuse to get away from Sabaoth. For a moment he paused, feeling a frown cross his face as he looked down at Sabaoth. Had there been something he had wanted to bring to Thrawn's attention? He was almost certain there was. Something having to do with Sabaoth and clones and the Mount Tantus project. But the thought wouldn't come, and with a mental shrug, he pushed the question aside. It would surely come to him in time. Stepping around the display ring, he followed his commander from the room. And that's the end of the first chapter. Let me know what you all think of the start of The Last Command. I'm curious to see where you think this is going if you're not familiar with the story. Talk to you all again soon.